Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Nightmares on Wax, Shout Out to Freedom. Ooh boy, Nightmares on Wax, George Evelyn. My thoughts on this guy got a lot more complicated in the past 2 years than they ever did before. If you'd talked to me at any point between 2014 and 2019, I would have said this guy is one of my favorite artists in electronic music. He's regularly been putting out rock-solid instrumental hip-hop and trip-hop projects on Warp Records that always had a really refreshing and uplifting laid-back energy to them. And his second album from 1995, Smoker's Delight, I marked as being among my top 20 favorite electronic albums of all time back in 2016. I own CDs of all his previous studio albums, and on top of that, he technically was the first discography review I ever wrote. Back before I started this channel, I'd written out reviews for all his albums in my Google Docs that never saw the light of day as practice to get me started on writing reviews in the first place. I've since deleted those old scripts, but I'd still be open to doing a series on him someday, since his stuff was really formative to my taste in this genre. So you may be wondering, what made my thoughts more complicated? What changed? Well, it didn't really have much to do with his music, but throughout 2020 and earlier 2021, I did see a whole different side to this guy that I was a lot less comfortable with, as he kinda came out as anti-vax on Twitter. He did thankfully wipe his Twitter during the lead up to this album, so those old posts aren't up anymore as far as I can see. And he did back down from some of the weirder statements he made as the pandemic went on and it was harder to ignore. But I distinctly remember him posting a lot of weird stuff about COVID being part of a government conspiracy back when it was first breaking out. And half of his timeline for like a full year was just making fun of vaccines, talking about how being forced to get the vaccine would be some kind of infringement on his personal freedom, going off on government censorship and how the powers that be are cracking down on points of view that don't align with the mainstream, seemingly indirectly in reference to his own viewpoints on public health. I mean, I'm all for people having the freedom to do and say whatever they want so long as they're not harming others. I agree with him on that particular point. And I do definitely understand his attitude as a non-white person who's fed up with being told what to do by the government and constantly getting screwed over and discriminated against in the process. I know he had good intentions with these posts, but I also believe that freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. I think spreading about the safety of the vaccines can in fact be harmful to other people and put them in danger whether you meant to do that or not. And his complaints about censorship often read to me as a little childish, not unlike those whining about cancel culture while seeing no damage to their bottom line. While again this didn't strongly shift my feelings on most of his actual music since he doesn't promote or explore these kinds of ideas there, it did further sour my already shrinking feelings on his last album from 2018, Shape the Future. Especially thanks to the track Tell My Vision, which was directly about how you should be respectful to conspiracy theorists even if you don't agree with them. A message I previously thought could be interpreted as a nice, relatable message to remain kind and understanding to your family even if their politics went off the deep end, but really started to hit more of a hollow and self-defensive note after he'd started posting weird conspiracy theories himself. Also didn't help that the beat on that track kinda sucked. But all this nonsense did also make me less excited for this latest album than I might have been otherwise. The possibility of some of this questionable messaging showing up more directly on record did exist, especially since it was called Shout Out to Freedom. But on the other hand, I had a feeling I'd have no problems with the music itself. That last album, as well as the one he dropped previous to it, Feelin' Good in 2013, marked a turn in his style from more traditional instrumental hip-hop towards much warmer and lesser instrumentation. And this album's various featuring credits, ranging from saxophonist Shabaka Hutchings of Sons of Kemet and The Comet Is Coming fame, and jazz drummer Wolfgang Hafner, to all number of vocal guests like Green T. Peng, Ocean, Pip Millett, and Mara TK, I had a feeling this project was going to continue in the same direction as his last two albums, maybe with a further increase in scope. I was really hoping he wasn't gonna go full Royce da 5'9", but at the same time, Shape the Future was a change of pace for him in its marginally more political focus, and his music had never been that deep to begin with. Some bad takes on Twitter obviously does not guarantee a bad album. I still kinda had to jump into this and give it a shot regardless, given how much of a fan I'd been of his music over the years. But what do we get with Shout Out to Freedom? It's okay, I guess. This album's markedly shorter on big standouts than Shape the Future was, though with one exception, it doesn't go into the weird conspiratorial territory I feared it might. Most of it was just kind of there. I guess I'll get that one exception out of the way first. There was one track called Wicked Satellites, where Green Tea Pang is brought in to give the album's most overtly political statements. And this one track did confirm a lot of my biggest fears of this album's messaging, mirroring the questionable tone of his Twitter timeline last year. For one thing, she may or may not have made a few passing references to that stupid 5G corona conspiracy, where the cell towers are spreading the virus and while I guess she never outright comes out and openly endorses it, she does kind of equate 5G to children mining minerals in Africa, and on the hook she juxtaposes satellites with corrupt politicians, as if to say the satellites are their tools to control people. I mean, it's entirely possible I'm off base here. Maybe she's complaining about the high cost of internet and cell providers, but those are some pretty iffy parallels to be making. If you're gonna call out dirty politicians, I feel like there's lots of better and more true-to-life ways to do it besides highlighting their supposed use of satellites. Also, naming the track after them does not help. He also drops one line about how the government is forcing people to buy their drugs, which... I mean, it's true that needing to pay so much for healthcare is really messed up, but I gotta ask, what drugs are the government literally forcing you to buy? I know the vaccine is getting mandated by most employers and that kind of thing, but isn't the vaccine free? It is over here in the US, and I'm pretty sure our healthcare system's way worse and more expensive than the UK's. Don't you people at least have, the NHS and not the endless mess of private insurance companies and $1,000 medical bills that Americans have to go through in order to get any kind of health care? Maybe I'm off base on that too. I am obviously not British and cannot speak from experience. Just, still not really feeling that line. I will give her credit for exploring some good points about the way society operates these days. She goes into consumerism and how we've all become reliant on all these devices and apps just in order to talk to our friends, but watch as said app companies track everything you do and sell all our personal information to ad companies, and how most of our bottom line goes towards all these big tech corporations who turn around and pollute the water and fuck up the air we breathe, even ruining space travel and making it another luxury for only the super rich to enjoy. But I'm being as charitable with my reading as this stuff as I can there, and it seems for every line with a good point there will be another line like, fact check the fact checkers, which gives the whole track that conspiratorial slant that undercuts even the good points and takes away from their credibility. And at least the beat is significantly better than Tell My Vision, but yeah, much in the same way that track sunk my enjoyment of Shape the Future quite a bit in retrospect, Wicked Satellites also sunk my enjoyment of this album a decent bit on its own. And I still feel like Tell My Vision is easier to interpret as a good message than this was. The good news about this album is that this was the only track here that actually tried to go that far in depth or try to go political, and most of it is the usual fare you'd expect out of him. There's no other tracks here that have that weird, possibly conspiratorial messaging as far as I can tell, or even really merit that kind of deeper lyrical analysis. The rest of this album is perfectly inoffensive. The bad news about this album is that it doesn't have any tracks on it that would rank among my favorites he's ever made, and the vast majority of it is just fairly middling and often feels like not as good versions of material he's already done in decades past. It's not quite as drastically all over the place, quality-wise, as Shape the Future was, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, I don't think any of this project's standouts hit the same heights as the best moments from that album, like Citizen Kane or Gotta Smile or the actual track Shape the Future. Heck, the album's lead single, Imagineering, kind of feels like a slightly weaker take on his track On It Maestro. While the string sections on this one sound fantastic and are enough to still make this track one of the standouts for me, the core piano loop driving the track isn't quite as strong or evocative as I'd like. Just feels oddly weak and lumbering in any of the moments when the strings aren't there. I'd say this album's two biggest high points for me were 3D Warrior and Up to Us, but even these are just good and not great for me. 3D Warrior does have a particularly cool experimental jazz feel with its mix of meandering saxophone licks from Shabaka Hutchings going over its low-key tribal sample loop. I do really have to give it credit for not sounding like any other Nightmares on Wax track I've heard to date. The kind of thing that might even feel more at home on that first Comet is Coming album and its spacey and jazzy approach to its sound. But this track still kinda has the feel of a weirder deep cut than a big important moment for the album, and has this oddly unpleasant and downtrodden vibe to it. The best Nightmares on Wax tracks really give me a comfy and warm feeling inside, and this one almost does the exact opposite of that. Up to Us, meanwhile, almost certainly the best track here overall. It's really got this lush 70s jazz, soul, blaxploitation soundtrack vibe to it, and its mix of flanging funk guitars and string sections especially really builds up near the end with some stronger live drums and horn sections, and it all sounds absolutely freaking gorgeous. But what prevents this track from reaching greatness is how bizarrely abrupt the ending is. It feels like this whole track was building up to some greater climax, and just as the instrumentation is swelling up in a way that's about to pay off on some grand final bittersweet note, the track instead just completely stops dead. I mean, it's true that some of my favorite Nightmares on Wax songs also end in that abrupt manner. For instance, Hey Ego from Thought So comes to mind. But that track didn't really build up like this one did. That one was just like the same loop over and over that you just sank yourself into, and as a result it didn't feel unnatural when the loop just kinda stopped. The build up on the back end of this track was so clearly pointing towards one last long sustained note at the end, and when it just cuts off like that instead, it totally catches me off guard and doesn't feel nearly as satisfying as it should have been. Even a fade out would have been better. So, that's the best track on this album. The rest of this album isn't bad, but ranges from decent to I guess I thought the other track with Shabaka Hutchings, Wonder, was pretty neat. One of the nicer sounding and more expansive sounding cuts here. Though also kind of reminds me of There For You from Feelin' Good, and isn't as good to me. Also, I feel like there's some weird panning stuff going on when the chords shift. It's subtle but noticeable enough where it makes me think my headphones are going on the blink. I guess I also thought Omi was pretty cool too, kind of a low-key 70s soul or Motown tinge thing, albeit a fairly skeletal and simplistic blend of it. And Creator SOS is basically just a less interesting sounding or memorable companion to that track. Breathe In has some nice punchy hip-hop beats and some verses from Ocean about getting off your phone and meditating. Not bad and made sense as a single, but not a track I ever particularly looked forward to. Isolated kind of feels like a more pleasant but not as good version of Deep Shadows from his last album, talking about wanting to hide away, and also featuring this meandering spoken word thing at the end that doesn't really add much. And Trillion is primarily notable for its rubbery 80s synth bass, but not much else. There's also a surprising amount of interludes here. There's the title tracks, I guess, which are two separate interludes called Shout Out and To Freedom. And they're just various snippets of voices saying the word freedom in different languages over a backdrop of wobbly synth cascades. Makes sense for a quick album intro, not sure if we needed a reprise though. Would You Bad is just a simple loop that repeats over less than 2 minutes and doesn't really offer anything all that notable. Reminds me of some of the filler cuts on Mind Elevation. But I did quite like Miami 80 and its mix of darker piano chords and much punchier beats that oddly hit harder than pretty much anything else on the album. That actually turned out to be one of the better tracks here, just kinda had me wishing it had gotten better developed and fleshed out. But right after that, he also includes a 34-second phone message from Green Tea Pang as an intro to the track She appears on, and that adds absolutely nothing. And that's every track on here. Just leaves me at the end like, really? That's it? I mean, the one track with kinda conspiracy theory-ish lyrics definitely didn't help, but my main issue with this project is just that it's so flavorless and bland by his standards. Just feels like the generic idea of what a Nightmares on Wax project should deliver. It's not an outright chore to get through, and he's never really been the kind of artist who I look to really push himself or go out of his comfort zone or anything. His sonic formula hasn't really fundamentally changed that much since the days of Smoker's Delight and Car Boot Soul, and it's worked great in all these years previous. Just this particular time it left me more checked out than anything else. You look at an album like Feelin' Good from 2013, that project isn't too different from this one from a sonic perspective, but there's just so much stronger and emotional core to every track. The downbeat moments felt especially sad and heartfelt, and the upbeat moments really carried a life-affirming energy, like he really wanted everyone to feel just as good as he was feeling. And this album has little to none of that for me. None of these tracks really make me feel much of anything. Much of it reminds me of the weaker material on an album like Thought So, and how it leans on the drier and more lifeless side production-wise, but Thought So also had much better and more memorable hooks, even in its weakest moments. And this one doesn't really have that going for it either. Most of these tracks just kind of disappear from my head once they're done and aren't really that fun even while they're on. They're just light and inoffensive background music more than anything. I mean, I'm sure this thing will still be worth a shot for his diehard fans. It seems to have been going over pretty well for other people, so maybe it'll resonate more for you. And even I don't think there's anything here worth hating or anything. But I expect a lot more out of him than what this delivers, and I would probably have to mark it as my least favorite album of his overall. So I'm overall feeling a 5.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
It's up to us.